There we go. Thanks everyone for coming to this um, meeting today, talk, mostly me talking, I guess. White Supremacy, a deeper look. So this is the third part of this series. As Elizabeth mentioned, each of these is meant to hold on its own independently, but they certainly build upon each other. And I might refer back to something. But they are all on the website, so I'm sure you know, not long after this is over, within the next week, this will also be up. So feel free to share it, share the link and that sort of thing. So I want to start with a quote. As during Reconstruction and the Civil Rights era, we face once again the danger that a politics of freedom and equality may be eclipsed by the psychology of white resentment. And I think it's a really important way to start out, because it doesn't say threatened by white supremacy. White supremacy is what we're talking about, but below sort of the ideology of white supremacy, and one thing that white supremacy really draws on is white resentment. And so we'll talk a bit about that today, and sort of the broadening of that beyond just our traditional understanding of white supremacy. So think about that a little bit. Think about what that might mean, why white resentment might be a huge part of the problem. I want to go over kind of just a working understanding of racism. If you've been with us before, you've probably caught on to this definition. But if not, I and many sociologists come from a perspective on racism as a systemic problem. That is not to say that individuals cannot be racist, but as sociologists, we look at the whole of the system, and it is not just one individual that creates the problem, right? It's when a whole society or culture or large group of people, institution upholds things like racism, that it's a problem. So it's more than just a few instances, more than just, extremists, and it's also greater than these individual beliefs. So we will talk about white supremacists, but honestly, I'm probably going to focus more on white supremacy, which is something that affects all of us. I also want to emphasize that we can reproduce, participate, and be complicit in white supremacy without being white supremacists. I think that's really important. One of the things that happens in people discussing racism is the "I'm not racist" conversation, or "I didn't do this," whatever. But we don't have to be in the Klan to participate in a culture that is white supremacist, to be complicit, to help uphold white supremacy. And so as we go along, just think about what that means. And, white supremacy in a broader sense than just hate groups themselves. The origins of white supremacy, it's kind of funny to me to try and talk about the origins of white supremacy, because particularly in the US, our history is pretty much entirely white supremacy. So we have lots of countries from Western Europe colonizing the United States, colonizing other places. And the logic of colonization was that we are chosen and these people are subject to the things that we are going to implement in wherever we are at, wherever we colonize, whether that's changing of laws, language, culture, that the way that we do things is best, meaning white people, or the Western Europeans who settled in different places. And therefore, we know what's best for the people here because we are more civilized. There's all this logic that's wrapped up in this idea of being colonizers and being like a chosen people. And that's part of what this phrase manifest destiny refers to, which you may have heard of before, particularly if we're talking about the colonization of the United States. Manifest destiny is this idea that a particular set of Western Europeans were chosen by God, were destined to settle in the United States and claim the land for themselves. So it was a way of justifying genocide, a way of justifying taking the land, of harming lots of folks, of doing sort of this mental gymnastics in people's minds. Why could we do these horrible things? Oh, because we're destined to be the rulers of this nation. And I challenge you to think about how a lot of people still kind of think that way. I also have the creation of whiteness on here because I would argue that sort of this idea of supremacy or Western European supremacy existed before this idea of whiteness. If you listen to other lectures or do some other research on whiteness, so whiteness wasn't actually a concept until later on in colonization. So we had all these different groups of people who were different ethnicities or from different countries, right? So when we think about early America, post-colonization, we see that, you know, there's the French and the Spanish and the English, and those people all considered themselves as separate groups. But one thing they did eventually have in common was slavery. And so what happened, and what happens over and over again in the history of the United States, is that an elite group of people sees that it's in their best interest to divide poorer and working class people and pit them against one another. And they do this with poor whites and blacks over and over again. So whereas once the Irish were not considered to be white, the Jews were not considered to be white, they get brought into this fold at different points. So if you're interested, there is a book called How the Irish Became White that focuses on a little piece of that. So these ideas of white supremacy, of certain groups of people being superior to other people, are embedded in colonization, in religion, in our economic system here in the United States. And we move up a little bit farther to the 1800s, and we pass at least the end of the Civil War and the beginning of freeing slaves. And in response to that, we see the eugenics movement. It was a movement that was a white supremacist movement that was really mainstream in the United States for a long time. So mainstream that it was supported by tons of people, just eugenicist language used in our government, in the ways that we discuss things politically, all of that. So eugenics was this idea that biologically, there's a group of people that's superior. So we move from a ideology where white supremacy is based on being chosen by God, and we have, you know, the rise of science, and then science gets used in particular ways to justify white supremacy. And then we see people writing like Madison Grant, who was a prominent eugenicist whose work got picked up by Hitler. So we tend to think in the United States of white supremacy as being, you know, Nazis over there somewhere else. But ideas of white supremacy have their roots in the United States. It's not that we looked to other places and then suddenly brought it here. And in fact, there were actual Nazis in the United States during that time, not just who came from Germany, like during that time, but who had already settled here. So then we have also more organized white supremacist groups. And the organization that we see comes in part from moving slightly in a different direction. So there were people who spoke out about colonization and treatment of Native Americans and people of color. But it was actually pointed out to me today that even people who were, some of whom were abolitionists, had white supremacist reasons for why they wanted abolition. One of them being that they didn't want more Black people brought to the United States. So early on, it's a basic logic of our nation. Later, it gets codified into like social movements and organized groups. And that becomes important because then there is something solid that we can fight against, right? It's not just completely, you know, taken for granted, but there is this logic that then we can pick apart and look and see that it's mostly just justifying the things that we already believed. And when I say we, I mean, you know, people in the United States. Okay, so what is white supremacist ideology? I think most people understand that white supremacy is anti-Black, that it is anti-Semitic, that those are pretty much foundational beliefs of white supremacy. If you're interested in sort of the legal logic of white supremacy in the United States, there's lots of information on there about the legality of whiteness and how whiteness was determined and who determined it and why. And that it's a pretty interesting concept to think about. It's not just anti-Black, but like about white racial purity, right? So it wasn't just like what's the word I'm thinking of? I'll get back to that. So it wasn't just that, it was about preserving this idea of white racial purity. So not just we don't want Black people, but we don't want Black people or Jews or anyone who is not white to blend in, to assimilate into United States culture. And it was a movement and continues to be a movement that rationalizes hate, violence, and justice, and pulls on this fear of white genocide. So earlier on in white supremacist ideology, you would hear phrases like racial suicide. And now you'll hear more things like white genocide or more general fears about whiteness disappearing. And that is sort of stoking the fire of fear and resentment that drives white supremacy. So a lot of us know these basic things, but also we need to think about how white supremacy is inherently anti-immigrant. So I spoke before about the Irish. There were early on a couple of different waves of immigration in the United States. We had colonization, and then later we had different Eastern European groups coming to the United States, as well as people from India, people from China, and other places that were not Western European. When this sort of second wave of immigrants started to come, this is when we see this codification of whiteness, of who is white and who is not, and how that struggle began. So a lot of this is supported by pseudoscience. And you'll also hear it referred to as race science. But when we're talking about race science, typically we're talking about this bunk wing of science that is not so scientific, actually, that is really supported by bias more than scientific inquiry, in fact. And I mention this because even today, there are a lot of arguments within white supremacist movements, or arguments that have white supremacist logic, that draw upon pseudoscience, that draw upon that mythology that will sound real smart, will try to sound really smart, which, you know, who doesn't want to sound smart, but it's not foundationally based on the facts. So we just have to be aware of that. White supremacy is reactionary to progress. So what we see over time is there's a push for more equality. And when that push is gaining momentum, that white fear and resentment basically rears its ugly head, and in reaction to that, we see sort of a backlash. It's also really important to point out that white supremacy is led by and benefiting American elites. So the imagery that we have of white supremacy tends to be poor Southern man, white man, who's part of the Klan. And while that's definitely a thing, much of the power of white supremacy has been in the organization of different American elites, the resources that get put into it, and who has the resources to organize. So more recently, it's been pointed out that the folks who stormed the Capitol on January 6th were not poor folks. They were CEOs. They were people who could afford to take off of work or travel, and they weren't what we tend to think of when we have this sort of imagery of a white supremacist. So it's important to have this class aspect of it to think about, because part of what the reason for this notion that we associate white supremacy with more working class or poor people who are white is because part of that was creating a sense of belonging for whites, which sounds weird because we live in a nation where whites belong. There's, you would think that there's not a need for a sense of white belonging, but there is something that American elites get from creating that. So again, if we go back to the creation of whiteness as a concept, we see that American elites, owners of plantations, basically set up a system wherein they emphasize the importance of skin color over class, right? And so you're poor, but you get a piece of this whiteness, right? And you get a piece of this power. You get told that you're important, right? And if we're talking about how that's used to often persuade poor folks, then that sense of belonging makes sense as it's butt up against this led by and benefiting American elites. It's also important to talk about white supremacy in the North. Again, we tend to think about white supremacy as being a Southern thing, when in fact, much of organized white supremacy has been in the North. So this picture here is from the Klan rally that was in 1923 in Dayton. There have been lots of things in this area. There are currently in Ohio many different groups who are white supremacist. I have a link at the end of the slide, which will be posted on the website, for the Southern Poverty Law Center, and they track hate groups, and they actually have a map, and you can go in there and look at all the different hate groups in your area, what they are, what they stand for, that kind of thing. Ohio, Indiana, Illinois were actually the seat of some really persuasive and really central Klan organizations and other white supremacist organizations. And so it's not that, as Northerners, we can say, oh, that's a Southern problem. There are differences, certainly, in the experience of the North and the South. But white supremacy has been strong in the North, just as it has been in the South. Again, we think about white supremacy, we think about Klansmen, and that's certainly, that is a thing that still exists, that's still an image that you'll see. But I want us to think a little bit more broadly about what white supremacy might look like. So one of my friends today sent me an article about this. One of our Ohio legislators has recently been appointed to the Ohio Senate Health Committee. So not Senate on the national level, but Ohio Senate Health Committee. He was appointed by his cousin, who is also in the Senate. Again, this has nothing to do with elites. Now, he is a doctor. He's at least a doctor on a health committee, right? So you could say, well, he's qualified. But there's this whole business of him saying some really, really racist things. And they are things that we might want to shrug off, some of us, but so last year he was at I believe it was a hearing or some Senate meeting about coronavirus, and specifically the disproportionate impact coronavirus has had on the Black community. And he questioned whether it was inequality, or was it just that certain groups of people aren't as clean as other groups of people, that they don't have the same hygiene practices. and he also used the word colored population, which is, maybe not something that we should be saying this day and age, particularly if you're a white person. And so, he brought these things up, and he definitely got flack for it. He definitely apologized for his comments. But now he is going to be leading the state health committee when he has demonstrated to clearly have some racist viewpoints or racist understandings of health. It's concerning that, but not surprising that he's a doctor, but also has these beliefs. So if it's not clear, literally what he was saying was that, Black people don't wear masks and wash their hands as much as other people, which, I mean, and he's not saying it, and then he's sort of like, maybe certain people don't have access to whatever. He was saying, well, maybe it's just that this group of people isn't as clean. Again, which, if we don't see this in the context of history, we might not see how racist that is and how deeply connected to the history of white supremacy that is. But if you look at almost any soap ads from the 1800s, you will see that soap companies often drew on tropes about cleanliness and race. So this is an ad for Pear's soap, the first step toward lightening the white man's burden, aka people of color, is through teaching virtues of cleanliness. Pear's soap is a potent factor in brightening dark corners of the earth as civilization advances, while amongst the culture of all nations it holds the highest place. It is the ideal toilet soap. So there are levels of racism in this ad, and that is the case for lots of different soap companies, including Ivory Soap, which, let's think about the naming of that for a minute. But there is a connection here, right? So this man and what he's saying about people and the racist notions that he has is not unconnected to the history of white supremacy, of the idea of a civilized white man being burdened by people who are less civilized, by immigrants, by folks who are of darker skin. So when we think about white supremacy, it's not always this, right? In fact, the bulk of the white supremacy that we're going to be exposed to is this, or maybe even something more subtle than this, right? So white supremacy is broader than that. So when I said racism is systemic, white supremacy is also systemic. The other thing to note is that while we see a lot of men being sort of the front and center, the media face, if they are showing their face, of white supremacy, which they often are these days, even though men tend to be sort of put up as like the image of white supremacy, women are central in white supremacy. So there's a great book called Women of the Klan by Kathleen Blee, about women who participated in Klan activities, who had their own Klan groups, who understood being a part of the Klan as women's empowerment, which is interesting since we tend to think of that as a liberal value. and we tend to think of racism as a conservative value. They're not. They're not necessarily binary in that way. So white women are often central to upholding white supremacy. White women are used in a lot of racist narratives, used historically to justify racial violence, used to epitomize a kind of white purity that should not be tarnished by anything else, any other non-white person. And while men are often the face of organized white supremacy, women do a lot of organizing in the background, a lot of the behind the scenes work, and a lot of the indoctrination of children. So for example, the white supremacist protest or white supremacist rally in Charlottesville several years ago was actually largely organized by a woman. So when we think about white supremacy, we have to think about white women and their place in that, particularly how white women get used in service of white supremacy, but also how white women can get away with white supremacy in certain ways by using their white femininity. So, you know, I've mentioned some white supremacist groups. It's important to note when we're talking about white supremacist groups that they're not all the same. They don't all have the same beliefs. There's a whole lot of overlap, but there are some differences in the ideologies. So for example, it's important to know that not every white supremacist is a white nationalist. So nationalism draws on this particular idea of what it is to be American, to be a sovereign nation, and to be a nation that should be a pure nation of white folks. There are neo-Nazis, neo-Confederates, draw on the history and the logic of the South and slavery. There are racist skinheads, which is a particular kind of sort of racist group that does tend to be associated with more working class folks. There are a group that you might have heard of more recently called the Proud Boys. One of the more high profile white supremacist groups these days, organizing a lot of different things, a lot of different, not just things like rallies, but media organizations, just having lots of different pull in different areas, not just the sort of outright race rioting that we're thinking of sometimes. Often a lot of these groups, including the Proud Boys, are also very sexist. And I know we just talked about women in the Klan, and that seems very contradictory, but the idea of supremacy and white male supremacy does tend to ring through these different groups. But we could talk about these white supremacist groups, and that's important to do. I'm not an expert on white supremacist groups. If you're really interested in white supremacist groups and the study of them, the Southern Poverty Law Center is a great place to start. They have not only like the hate map that I talked about, but they have like policy updates. They watch different hate groups. They track things that are happening within those hate groups. They have a podcast that really looks into like sort of what this culture of white supremacy and cultures of hate are. And they have just a lot of reports and information that's really good. So I highly recommend Southern Poverty Law Center. But again, white supremacy is built into our culture and the way we think. Let me check my time. Okay. It's built into our culture and the way we think. And I want to start here and think about that and not just about these hate groups, because you know, while we may know people who are part of hate groups, or we may come across people who are part of hate groups, the hate groups are the extremes, but the threat is also in the normal everydayness of white supremacy, because even though we've had resistance to white supremacy over time, the logic still persists within our culture. So here are some examples of what white supremacy or support for white supremacy might look like. Portraying white racial fears as justified, including fears of demographic change. This is something that often happens in the media. The media will play on this fear that, you know, that white people will be in the minority, that, you know, the demographics are changing, and that's something that is overwhelming and something to be fearful of. I sort of can play it as this sensationalist thing, and that's playing on those white racial fears. Discourse about special privileges or reverse racism. So what this tends to be is a recasting and an appropriation of ideas about anti-racism. So things like affirmative action are things that are put in place, and we can talk about the different types of affirmative action, but just generally, affirmative action is put in place to make up for discrimination and racism that has existed, right? But what will happen is that people will turn that around and say, well, that's a special privilege. I'm white, I don't get that. But you don't need a special privilege if you've had, you know, the benefit of being white and having a history that looks like our history does, where white people have benefited not just culturally, but economically and in terms of power over time. You'll also hear claims of reverse racism. And that's not to say that someone who is a person of color couldn't have a prejudice for white people. But if we go back to that early slide where I say racism is a system, there is not a system of racial inequality that does not benefit white people. So the system that we have, the racist system, is one that benefits white people. And so reverse racism is something that actually doesn't make any sense, because if we see racism as something that's a system, then there is no reverse system, right? It may happen that there are instances where someone is prejudiced, but that does not mean that the whole system is against people. Even though that white racial fear you will hear over and over again, this idea of reverse racism is part of this mythology that white people are being persecuted. Also, support for white supremacy looks like downplaying less extreme white supremacy. So, well, it's not really that bad because, you know, it wasn't an extreme thing to say, or they didn't use a racial slur. And that's really problematic, because it's tacitly saying that as long as you play this line that white supremacy is okay, or less concerning, when in fact a lot of the white supremacy that we see as okay is what we should be most concerned about. Support for white supremacy also looks like complacency about racists shaping policy and law. And it also looks like not knowing that your representative was the one who was saying that COVID was a bigger problem for Black people because they don't wash their hands. Like, I didn't realize that was my representative until today. And so, there's a problem in our culture being complacent about that's either not a big deal, or that there are so many things that are flashing at us that doesn't stick with us. But then also being complacent about that, or feeling like you can't do anything about it. We can definitely do things about racists being our representatives, shaping policy, being part of our law system, whether that's on any part of the criminal justice system. It also looks like more trust in or empathy for people who are white. We see this in studies of it all the time. Recently, there has been more talk about how doctors in general perceive Black people's pain as being exaggerated, and white people's pain as more, white people expressing pain as being more legitimate. So that trust and that empathy for people who are white necessarily means less trust in people of color. Downplaying the concerns of people of color. So this is something that happens all the time. So it can't be that bad, or why is that such a big deal, or, and I think sometimes people want to, they get put in a place where racists are dictating these arguments, and they don't want to seem like they're taking a side, even though, you would think you would take the anti-racist side, but we live in an all-side society where our boundaries around those things are kind of skewed. So I think some people will think that they're playing devil's advocate, or they're being intellectual by questioning whether that's a real thing. But downplaying the concerns of people of color is not the way to get to answers about problems. It's not the way to address problems for people of color. And if we look at that, having more trust and empathy for people who are white, we might question if we just feel an impulse to downplay those concerns, because as it's part of our culture, we're taught those things. The other thing that supporting white supremacy looks like is letting fear of backlash or conflict inhibit anti-racist action. So particularly for white folks who are often taught that they should be nice over all else, whatever nice is like. And what that really often means is conflict avoidant. I'm guilty of being conflict avoidant at times, but if we let this fear of conflict or fear of backlash dictate our actions, then that's letting racism dictate the rules of the game. And so we'll hear a lot of things about sort of extremist views. And well, if we do this, then, you know, the extremists there will be an extremist backlash, or there will be a backlash against, you know, people who question climate change or what have you. But we can't constrain our actions and anti-racist progress around what that backlash is going to be. And in fact, what we see over and over again is when there is the most potential for progress, we see lots and lots of backlash, which is part of what we're seeing right now. So while extremist white supremacy is real and it's harrowing, it also makes less than extreme white supremacy seem more reasonable and non-threatening. So if white supremacy is only these extremes, if it's only burning crosses, if it's only this, then people can distance themselves from white supremacy and from holding white supremacy to account, whether that's people who are espousing white supremacy or engaging in white supremacy, or just the ideals within our culture. So it sets up an extreme. So I used to use this metaphor with students where, you know, say your friend says, man, I really love this movie. I think I'm really going to love it. Will you please, it's going to be so good. Will you go to the movies with me? And you go to the movies and it's an okay movie, right? So what happened was they set the bar here and the movie ended up here, right? So then there's this gap between the expectation and the reality. Or someone could be like, wow, I think this movie's just going to be, it might be okay. But will you watch it with me anyway? Or, you know, I'm not sure about this movie, you know, the bar's down here. Well, then you can be pleasantly surprised, right? So setting extremes is really actually a political tactic that's used to get us to be like more moderately extreme, if you will, right? So if the extremes are pushed farther and farther over, then what's considered acceptable also comes farther and farther over, which is why it's not just important to think about people who espouse white supremacy. In fact, lots of people who have white supremacist beliefs would not call themselves white supremacists. But they take actions and espouse beliefs that are still white supremacist. So whether someone is an avowed white supremacist or just has white supremacist beliefs, or, you know, upholds a white supremacist system, we need to pay attention to those things as well. In particular, the ways that white racial resentment can be used to convince people that it's a better idea to buy into white supremacist ideas than to think in different ways. So challenging white supremacy, listen to and support people of color and people of color-led organizations. Join an organization working to fight white supremacy. Get trained in bystander intervention. So SURJ, showing up for racial justice, will often do different bystander interventions. Obviously, they're going to be virtual at this point, but what that means is getting people to practice when they see racism or white supremacy. How do you act? How do you behave, right? Because for the most part, no one trains us how to intervene, how to speak up when these things happen. And white supremacy and sort of the momentum of white supremacy really depends on us not intervening, really depends on us being quiet. So bystander intervention, and even just practicing different scenarios with your friends about what you might do and what's appropriate to do in certain situations is always a good call. Call your representatives and demand change. This is a really basic thing that you can do. You can also write your representatives. You can email them, but calling and leaving a message is also a really effective thing. There's also a service called ResistBot, and you can text, and they will send letters for you, or you can sort of dictate a letter to them to send to your representative. But I really highly advocate calling your representatives. It can be anxiety producing, but the reality is you're going to talk to a voicemail or you're going to talk to an aide. You're not calling your representative and they're going to pick up the phone. They have people who answer the phone who their job is just to take down what you say. So they're going to want your name, they're going to want your zip code probably, and then they're going to ask, what you have to say. And I would suggest when you do call that you have something concrete to say, not just like down with white supremacy, but like what are some actual actions that can be taken. So like vote yes on this or support this going to a vote or what have you. Utilize your white privilege for anti-racist means. Educate yourself and do the work. Do not rely on people of color to educate you or to speak up when they see racism or white supremacy. If something potentially racist or based in white supremacy is pointed out to you, whether it's something you did or something someone else did or something else that exists, deeply consider that. And if it is something that you did, apologize. And if you question, is this white supremacist? It's not hard to take a step back and do some research, right? So when I was talking about the senator who made the racist comments, the Ohio Senator, Huffman, if you didn't understand that beyond just thinking that one group of people has just wholesale poor hygiene, which not even the logic in that is just so flawed. But even if you thought, maybe he was just trying to play devil's advocate or trying to think of the different possible scenarios in which there could be a cause for this disproportionate health. Even then, if you don't see the connection to the historical racism and white supremacy, you might not understand the impact, particularly if you're a white person. So don't try to explain it away. Don't try to, play devil's advocate. Just take a step back and apologize and actually deeply consider what this might mean.